fortunate. We have Paul Freitag, who's the executive director of Wishfish, and Mark Jennings, who's the soon-to-be executive director of Project Find. And they are going to discuss, hopefully, I'd like a little background on senior housing on the Upper West Side, as well as the projects that you are involved in, because Wishfish has just opened up a gorgeous new facility on 108th Street. And Mark, I haven't seen Park 79 yet, but they have converted an old hotel into senior housing. And this is very important to us because more than 20% of the residents of Community District 7 are seniors. And seniors particularly have fixed incomes, and there are problems getting appropriate housing for them. So why don't we start with, let me just say that I want to welcome Howard Yarus, who's the new member of the Housing Committee.
Thank you. Thanks.
And Louisa, I'm Roberta Seymour, and I'm
Absolutely
chair of the Senior Task Force, and we're delighted to have Paul and Mark here. Unfortunately, Jenna couldn't make it, but I think Paul will be doing her presentation.
Yes, I'm sorry, I hadn't gotten to you yet, but why don't we start with Paul and go from there?
Okay, and everyone can hear me?
Yes.
One moment, please.
Okay.
I'm sorry, one moment. Molly, I'm so happy to see you. I want to introduce Molly Liu, who is our fellow from the Foundation for the City of New York, and she is working on an affordable housing project for us and doing an inventory of affordable housing on the Upper West Side and how to promote it. So I'm glad that you could join us. Okay, I'm sorry, Paul.
No, it's great. So our game plan for today was going to be that Wishfish's director of real estate development, whose name is Jenna Brynas, was going to first do a very quick kind of level setting presentation talking about affordable housing versus supportive housing versus senior housing, really just to make sure we're all on the same page. Jenna unfortunately fell ill this afternoon, so she actually ended up going home early from work. She shared her presentation with me, so I'll be presenting her presentation. I want to apologize. It may be overly basic for many of you, but just because a lot of terms tend to get thrown around, we sort of wanted to start with that. Jenna came to Wishfish after many years at HPD in the city. And so she actually is sort of put together a little few slides kind of based on how the city typically, presents, these concepts when they're doing presentations. So, and anyway, so I'm going to do Jenna's presentation. Hopefully it'll take, literally 6-7 minutes. And then Mark's going to talk a little bit about Project Find's work on the Upper West Side. Then I'll come back and do the presentation that I was going to do, which is talking about Wishfish's sort of housing on the Upper West Side. So that's the game plan for today. Let me share my screen. Okay, we're going to go to this one. Okay, so everybody should be seeing a screen image of actually our 108th Street project that Louisa mentioned previously. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, so let me go over here. Okay, so we're just going to go to a few definitions here. So it's kind of, this is sort of, going at the broadest, sort of, what is affordable housing? And in general, these days, when people talk about affordable housing, what they're really talking about is housing in which the household does not spend more than 30% of its income on rent and utilities. Now, this is a national standard. It's not just something in New York. It's actually across the country. When you talk about affordable housing, this is, the idea is that you shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your income on the housing. The next element of affordable housing, and is that it's regulated. That there are typically a government entity, state, federal, city, that is overseeing the housing and making sure that it is remaining quality housing and that is limiting its rent or its sales increases. And then the other very important factor of affordable housing is typically it's assisted. So it can be assisted either because of a great deal of subsidy put into the project in the beginning to set it up in such a way that it can operate charging only affordable rents, or it can be assisted through a program that's providing an ongoing rent subsidy to the people living in the housing. Okay, so that is affordable housing. Okay, now the question is, what is supportive housing? So the idea behind supportive housing is that baked into the housing, like a really fundamental part of the housing, is that you are providing services for the residents living in the housing. And I feel like whenever I say this, people are sort of like, well, what's the big deal? I mean, it was sort of a breakthrough, in the 90s when really affordable housing started being done, because historically you would sort of have your housing and then whoever was operating it would go out and try to get funding to do services. And essentially the idea here was that really the two needed to be integrated in order to really get, all the quality that you could out of the housing. Typically, supportive housing is housing the most vulnerable. It's often people who have a history of homelessness. It might be people who have a history of sort of mental illness or something that, they are a group of people that typically are in need of services and for whatever reason have a difficulty remaining housed. One of the very important things about supportive housing is that it is not a facility or a shelter. It is permanent housing. And so the residents who live there, they sign leases, they pay rent, they have house rules, just like you would living in any other rental building. There's no curfew, there's no visiting hours. Typically, you have your own kitchen, your own bathroom, you sign a lease, you have to pay the rent on time. You could be evicted if, in fact, you don't pay your rent. Okay. So, the question is, supportive housing is often the same as any type of affordable housing, but really, how is it different? And the key are these on-site social services and case management. An important thing is that the services are optional. The people living in supportive housing are not coerced into having services, but, the idea is that you have a skillful social services staff that creates a what's called a person-centered services plan that's really addressing the needs of that specific tenant. And it's important that I use the word tenant. When you live in housing, you're thought of as being a tenant. You're not thought of as being a client. And in New York City, most supportive housing is operated by not-for-profit organizations. And many of them were our organizations that provide, that providing social services is really core to their mission. Okay, and just to give a sense of what are the types of services that are provided, usually there's a case management model. So you have a social worker who's really assigned to a resident and really working with that resident to understand what their needs are. Often there are peer support programs. Actually, the quality of community that you get in supportive housing, where the residents really support one another, is a very important aspect of supportive housing. Depending on the age of the residents, you can have job training. For WSFISH, and I know also for Project Find, access to healthcare is a very, very important aspect of living in supportive housing. In some cases, you'll be teaching independent living skills, depending on, if, for instance, the residents are folks who have a history of, living with mental illness. And in general, there's a goal of really trying to integrate the people living in supportive housing into the community where their housing is located. This is sort of from HPD, what people ask is, well, is supportive housing the same thing as a shelter? And, and it is not the same thing as a shelter. Supportive housing is permanent, affordable housing. It is not a facility where people are moved to, when they have formerly been living on the street and, and do not have quality, do not have access to permanent housing. There's an idea that supportive housing somehow is a blight to the neighborhood. And in general, there's a real focus on building supportive housing so that, in fact, it integrates in with the neighborhood and, and can be a good neighbor, to the buildings and, blocks that surround it. Typically supportive housing actually has security as part of it. It often has programming, it has staff. So it has many things that actually can even contribute to the safety of the neighborhood. And then finally, there's this idea that supportive housing, is, and depending on your viewpoint, should be concentrated in low-income communities of color. And, that is not true. Supportive housing is actually located in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And a very interesting fact is that 50% of the units funded by HPD are located in Manhattan below 96th Street. So supportive housing is not just something that you find kind of in, the more troubled neighborhoods of the Bronx. Okay, now to move on to senior housing. So, the big issue with senior housing is just the fact that the senior population is exploding. And as it's exploding, many of the seniors are on fixed incomes and they really can't find a place that they can afford to live in. So to give some of the statistics, between 2010 and 2040, the number of New Yorkers who are 65 and older is expected to increase by 40% to more than 1.4 million people. More than half of the senior renters in New York City are rent burdened. So rent burden means that they are paying more than 30% of their income for rent. And, and often, they can be paying significantly more than 30% of their income in order to find a place to live. And the next fact is that more than 1/3 actually spend more than half of their income on rent, because there's such a mismatch between their income and the rents that you can find in New York City. There is a type of senior housing, independent senior housing, that I'll show you examples of. Wisfish operates several of these, which are called 202s. 202s are affordable senior housing. The reason they're called 202s is that the legislation that enabled them was HUD legislation, that was titled, legislation 202. That's why we call them 202s. So there are about 200 202s in New York City that have about 16,000 units. But meanwhile, we have about 200,000 seniors on waiting lists for those 16,000 units. And the average time spent to get that you would spend on a 202 waiting list before you would actually get into housing is about 7 years. And then most importantly, the 202 program was stopped more or less about 20 years ago. It now is actually re-beginning, but in a much more diminished way. So, essentially 202s are not a type of housing that, of which there's a lot more being built. And so in response to this, the city actually started a new program that Jenna, she was heading up this program at HPD. It's called the SARA program, which stands for Senior Affordable Apartments, Senior Affordable Rent Apartments, I guess is the SARA. And the idea is that this is affordable housing for seniors age 62 and up, with incomes up to 60% of area median income. So New York City is very fortunate to actually have a program to develop new senior housing. There are not many cities in America that are actually doing this. Just to say, it's often tied in with a funding program called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, which is abbreviated here as LIHTC. And then HPD gives subsidy in order to build these units. And most importantly, along with these units, you get project-based rental assistance. So the city both contributes in order to allow the buildings to be built in an affordable way, and then also provides an ongoing subsidy in order to allow the building to continue to be affordable for seniors. And then a very important part of it is that 30% of the units are actually reserved for homeless seniors. So if you built a 100-unit SARA building, 30 of those units would be reserved for seniors who are coming out of homelessness. And I can talk more about that when I talk a bit about Wisfish's buildings. So just so I know, one of the things we were asked by Louise is, what can you do to support affordable housing? And I think, as all of you know, the important thing is to really support it on the community level to overcome, NIMBYism against building supportive and senior housing. And then I think very importantly, the funding sources for a lot of this housing actually start at the federal level. And in the case of New York, they often go from the federal level to the state level, and then eventually they pass through the state and come to the city. So, and I think that people don't realize is that advocacy really, can happen on 3 different levels. So it can be working at the federal level in order to really, make sure the spigot that all the money is flowing from, is open and that housing is prioritized. It can definitely happen on the state level. We're beneficial in New York City that we can, develop and run programs tapping into both state programs and city programs. And then, as I actually started with, an important thing also is to advocate on the city level in order to not, make sure that there's support that allows senior and supportive housing to be built. Okay, so actually I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass it over to Mark now and let him talk a bit about Project Find.
Mark, you're muted.
I'm getting myself together to share, so let me see if I can get this correct. All right, get this thing out of the way. Starting the slideshow. So, all right. I don't know if this thing is in the way or not. If you can even see that. So, I mean, just to start with, this is just a list that I got from the Supportive Housing Network in what is that? In March of this year, to be able to show in CB7 some of the types of supportive housing that are in the area. What you may not see here is some of our buildings, and again, that goes back to some of the sort of semantics around what is considered supportive housing or affordable housing in the neighborhood. We have at Project Find have several buildings. So we have the Hamilton located at on 73rd Street, the Hargrave House located on 71st Street, the Woodstock Hotel down on 43rd, and as we've come to know, and we've come here several times to talk about Park 79 that we're working with in conjunction with Fairstead on 79th Street. Just in general, Project Find's mission, is just to provide services to low, moderate income, and homeless seniors, and so that means housing. That means we have older adult centers embedded in our housing. And so most of our community room space has been transformed into older adult centers. Our Hamilton Center, we operate 4 of them, one out of Woodstock, Coffee House across from Port Authority. And we operate a older adult center in the Clinton houses as well. And so our 4 projects, as we said, we have on-site services, need-based programming. We do a lot of community partnership. We also run a homeless in-reach program for homeless seniors, where we help them to get housing applications to potentially be able to move into some supportive housing sites. And so we've come to know a lot of people who may be sleeping on the street and the like. We provide shower services, psychiatric services, medical services through the Article 28 clinic run by Dr. Batra in NYU Langone. And so we have a bevy of services that we offer. You see here just some of the flyers for, we also partner. So we don't try to do everything on our own. So we're not saying the 2 social workers that we have in any building is going to resolve every problem and issue in the world. We do partner with other community organizations. We work closely with the road, and we work closely even with each other as we all have different sort of programming that we can collectively utilize. And on the far right here, you see us participating in the CB7 fair prior to COVID, led by Roberta and the senior task force that was held at the Douglas houses at that point in time. Park 79, you all wanted to learn a little more about. So we We definitely are working with Fairstead, and we're a nonprofit owner and social service provider in this endeavor, and we're excited to extend our work in terms of senior housing into this particular project, and we're happy that Fairstead thought enough of us to bring us in as a partner in this endeavor, and that's going to be a little over 78 units of housing, specifically for utilizing the Sarah project that was just mentioned. And so that's how we're able to bring in a few folks from the shelters who are all, again, meet the age requirements, and then also bringing in some people through lottery. And to go back to that notion of the many people on the list, 30,000 people applied for the units here at Fairstead, at Park 79. Looking towards the future for us, we would love to find new housing and new housing opportunities. We were really looking at this building at 101st Street, and we really loved it. We went and got an architect, and we were working on seeing how we could make this work and how we could buy this building. And we got beat out by folks who had a little bit more capital in the bank than us, and who could access money a little bit more quickly. And so we're actually excited to hear Mayor Adams' new plans about sort of figuring out how to relax some of the red tape that keep us from accessing buildings in this particular way. Since we have to, as nonprofits, we have to go through government partners and get sort of financing. We don't just have the money sitting there to go buy a building in cash. And so therefore, sometimes we lose out on a number of deals. So we're hopeful that new legislation coming down the line will help us, and we're hopeful that the community board can really look at some of these and support some of these legislation and other things that really support supportive housing projects. And lastly, in a lot of this, we talked about, what do you hear? What do we hear and what we don't hear? We hear, this is it's gonna bring more crime. People don't have any income. It's gonna be a lot of loitering from these people, right, that are in these spaces. And the reality, especially in the housing that we're bringing with older adults, things we don't hear about are the fact that we have voters, right? We have polling stations in our senior centers. Many of you all might even come by to do your voting there. We have voters, and the politicians know that too, because they come visit us. When it's voting season. So we see a lot of folks at our centers and in our spaces. We have taxpayers. There, as was mentioned, property values increase, and we work with the community. I think we just recently held the police community meeting at our Hamilton Center just as well. And I just wanted to just share, we have a little bit of information from our homeless in-reach program. And some of the primary reasons that people, this is just from our intake survey, where folks are homeless, when we think about those folks, because most people are just saying they just don't have enough money to pay rent or to pay the mortgage, and some people, just living with family and friends, and just to try to make ends meet. And then we have some people coming in from sort of institutions and other things, or I just lost my job in tough markets like 2008, et cetera, where life sort of hits us. And so I think that's just something to be able to think about. Having affordable housing is ultra just important. And I think another thing that I just wanted to show, which is give some of the myth busting, is like the highest grade completed of those folks that are coming through our program. We have some people with PhDs and master's degrees, and not just no college and those things. Many people have gone through high school, et cetera. And so life really, may hit us all in different kind of ways. and having a supportive housing space, affordable housing in the city, in CB7, is vital for those to be able to, for many people to be able to stay in New York and thrive in New York.
Thank you.
Paul, I'm gonna pass it back over. I had a little video,
Okay.
but I'm gonna skip that, and the sound's not necessarily working, but I'll make sure you get the link. It was really gonna show you a little bit of one of our tenants, Ivan Black, who came in and is helping us with our rooftop garden and working and doing many different things. And I think we don't always see in terms of what, and I used to be part of the media, so but we don't always see those feel good stories. It doesn't have any conflict. And when I was in the newsroom, they said if a story doesn't have conflict, it's not a story. And so those things we don't often see, but they exist more than the other sort of items. And I just want to really stress that as we acknowledge sort of community concerns around supportive housing sites.
Thank you. We'll
Okay.
have questions afterwards.
Okay, so I'll quickly just run through my presentation. Let's see, here we go. Share, okay. Everybody can see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great, okay. So let me just move on to the next slide. I gotta click here. There we go. So, what I want to do is profile sort of really Wistfish's buildings on the Upper West Side. Wistfish is now, really active in 3 areas. We have, of course, started on the Upper West Side, and it's where we have, the most activity, the most buildings. We are also active in Harlem. And more we have a growing presence in the Bronx. So we've had a number of recent buildings that are actually in the Bronx as well. Those are the 3 areas where Wistfish is active. We are not looking, at this point to do buildings in Brooklyn or Queens or in other parts of New York City. We really want to focus on what we consider to be our geographic catchment area. The way that we think about our buildings is, I think what's unique about Wistfish, in comparison to many senior housing providers in the city, is that, we really try to serve the full spectrum of seniors. And we do that in a variety of different types of housing. And so, we have one shelter, which is Valley Lodge. I'll be talking a bit about that. And it is a shelter exclusively for older New Yorkers. Then we have SROs, we have independent housing, and then we also, like Project Find, run older adult centers. And this map is showing, where the different Wistfish buildings are located in CB7. I'm gonna move on to the next slide, focus a little bit. Okay, so just now to talk about each type. So, Wistfish runs one shelter, Valley Lodge, which is in our brand new building now on 108th Street. It had previously been on 108th Street for over 30 years. While we were building the new building, we relocated it out, and it has now moved back into the building. And then we actually have 4 SROs on the Upper West Side. 3 are occupied. 1 is currently under development. Euclid Hall, Cole House, the Westbourne, and the one that will be shortly under development is 3 Arts. And each of these, serves a population that, for the majority of seniors living in RSROs have had a history of homelessness. And what makes an SRO is that instead of having a full apartment that, is your own apartment, you actually have your own room, think sort of as a dorm room. Sometimes these rooms will have, we provide them all with sort of mini refrigerators. Sometimes they'll have sinks in them. Every now and then they might have a half bath, kind of depends on, the particular building. And then in all of our SROs, we actually provide congregate meals. We provide, there's a recreation room, there are shared kitchens. So there are actually spaces for, the seniors to actually, cook and, use different facilities jointly in a congregate setting. We have 2 older adult centers. One is the center at Red Oak, which is on West 106th Street. And then we have a sort of satellite to the Red Oak, which is our Douglas Senior Center located in the Douglas houses. And this picture is hot off the press. This is from our holiday celebration that we had at the Red Oak actually last Friday. The director was very excited and sent me to this, so sent me the picture, so I included it in the presentation. And then finally, we have a number of independent housing buildings. So in these buildings, you actually, have your own apartment, typically a 1-bedroom or a studio. And in these buildings, we also provide social services, but they often are not at the same intensity as we provide, in our SROs. And in our SROs, we actually have a fairly small caseload per social worker. As we get to our independent housing, the caseload grows, primarily because the seniors, don't have as extensive needs as they do in our SRO housing. This is actually the entrance to the Marseille, which was Wisfish's very first building, located on West 103rd Street. So now I'm going to just profile our newest building, which is our new building, Wisfish at West 108, which also includes Valley Lodge, our shelter. So this is a complicated building. It actually has 4 unique elements. So it has our senior homeless shelter. It has supportive housing dedicated for seniors. And then it actually has straight ahead just affordable family housing as part of it as well. And then very, very importantly, we've partnered with the Institute for Family Health, which is an FQHC, a federally qualified health center. And as part of the building, we built a very large health center, which provides free or very low cost healthcare, not just to our residents, but actually to anybody in the community who is in need of healthcare. So it's sort of 4 elements. There are other things about the building too, but those are the 4 primary elements in the building. This is actually the lobby on, sort of the permanent housing side. This shows an example of a supportive housing room. So if you are a senior moving into one of our supportive housing studios, it comes furnished. The people moving into it don't have furniture to move in. So, this is actually the typical layout that somebody will have as they move into one of our supportive housing studios. And this shows actually a shelter room. We feel like having done this for a long time, we feel like 3 is the magic number in terms of how many people you would put together in one shelter room. Valley Lodge has a combination of rooms that have 3 and 4. What we like about that number, we feel like it provides some privacy, but it also, there's a sense of community develops. And frankly, it's not as nice as permanent housing. So, it actually incentivizes, the people in the shelter to continue the search, to work with our social workers, to then move out of the shelter and into permanent housing. Let's see, why am I not going to the next one? Oh, there we go. And this I'm going to go back one if I can. So in this, it just gives you a sense of kind of, the level of details within the building. The picture at the upper left corner with the yellow tile, that's actually the dining room in the shelter, in which looks out over the playground next door. We have a shot showing a typical elevator lobby on the permanent housing side. And then on the right is actually the entrance to the building. This is a unique building in that it does combine a shelter and permanent housing in one building. And you, in fact, go through the same front door. There's a front desk there that is, serving both sides. And one of the goals of this was to really try to completely integrate, the shelter for homeless seniors in with housing, permanent housing, as to really show that the shelter is part of a continuum of providing housing, for seniors. Okay, and now I will stop sharing, and we can move on to questions, I guess.
Before questions, I would just like to comment that both Project Find and Wishfish have come to us prior to developing a building and have been really wonderful about listening to some of the concerns and on Valley Lodge and the 108th Street building. Many changes were made to include the Central Park the Central Park
medical unit.
Yeah, and which was a great. There's a little garage on the western side of the building that houses the ambulances. And the cafeteria opens up to the playground. So there's eyes on the street and eyes on the playground. So we're very appreciative of both Wishfish and Project Find.
This is Bob Espio over here, and this project was impressive from the very beginning, from discussion, and it's true to the original design, so that's certainly much appreciated. My question is, well, it's not incidental, nothing is incidental, but with the stuff that people come with, how do you manage the things that they come in with? And I don't mean the bundles that the homeless may have as part of their possessions. I mean, just a regular person that's an occupant that comes with stuff. How do you manage that? I don't see how that can be accommodated within the apartments.
So for the supportive housing units, most of those people are actually moving in, out of a shelter or out of, some situation where they've been in transitional housing. So they don't arrive typically with much furniture. They may have, one or two personal items. They of course have clothing, et cetera, and we, actually have sort of different protocols that we use in order to make sure that we're not bringing bed bugs into the building. But, for, those units, typically the furniture we provide is really what they need. Now, for the affordable family units, that's just like moving into any apartment. Those apartments are unfurnished. The families that move into there, bring whatever furnishings they have, and they set it up just like you would moving into any apartment.
Thank you.
How large are the affordable family units?
There are a mix of studios, 1, 2s, and just a couple 3s.
Luis and Roberta, I just want to flag that there is a comment in the Q&A from a member of the public.
Okay.
How about this? I can read it. The comment is from Cynthia Tibbs. What do you plan on doing regarding the complaints regarding Independence House? Rats, garbage, laundry room not functioning, broken elevators.
So Independence House is a building that Wishfish acquired shortly before the pandemic. We began doing renovations there, and everything got completely ground to a halt during the pandemic. We have actually, and so it was sort of mid-construction, we did things in order to, essentially allow it to safely stop construction. And then about a year ago, we have re-begun construction. The goal is actually, I guess really last May, June is when we re-began construction. The goal is to actually finish that up by actually May, June of this year. The finishing the construction, it takes about 1 year. We have had, we are actually doing a brand new laundry room as part of the building. The building was scaffolded. We were doing a lot of work on the exterior of the building. As unfortunately we had a situation with a homeless person who decided to live under the scaffolding in front of the building. We, worked with different agencies in order to have that person, moved into a safer arrangement. So we have been dealing with different situations at Independence House that, are part and parcel with renovating an existing building. Actually, a lot of scaffolding very recently came down, which I'm happy to say. And our goal is actually, we're addressing all of these issues as we're going through the renovation.
If I may add, on Cynthia's point, I live across the street in 7-Eleven, and I receive a few calls from 176. By the way, my mother was there for decades, very happy. And and the complaints that I got from a few people and who knew that I was on a community board, and they said, you need to help us. And that the deteriorating rate of the property was so severe, and that they just didn't know where to turn. Someone told them, SBA was, his mother used to live in here, sort of thing. And so that even I understand that there was a security guard who had been terminated who offered to, quote unquote, testify as to the conditions of the center. And I didn't expect it to come up at this particular meeting, which is a separate Wishfish. And that, so I had sent Shelley a note that if he can help organize QA in the building for the community, the residential community, to understand what is being done to remedy what they are describing as a deplorable situation there. So that, and only because Cynthia brought it up, I had been raising it with Shelley, but Cynthia brought it up, and separate from Uptown, which is miraculous, really, in my view. This is a rapidly deteriorating situation and deplorable, and it's oppressive. So that this is just a footnote to Cynthia's comment.
Well, I mean, just to say, when we bought the building, it was in need of significant renovation. That was part of what, was Wishfish's plan for the building. Unfortunately, we had started that work. It all got stopped. And I understand the residents were very frustrated that were sort of mid renovation when we were forced to stop during COVID. We now are back in construction, and we actually are meeting very regularly with the residents. We actually are providing newsletters explaining about the renovation, and it is our goal by next summer, we will actually have had have the building fully renovated.
Yes, good.
Can people raise their hands if they have a question and mute if they don't?
Carolyn? You're muted.
I'm not now.
Okay.
Just a question. I'm a little confused. How do the new buildings qualify or stand next to the old-fashioned rent-stabilized apartments that were created, like the rent-stabilized apartments of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s that are, I think that we have about 100,000 of them in the city right now. How are these new buildings, equating to them?
Mark, do you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I can say, like, for Park 79, though we have all of these, like we're talking about, this is a Sarah project, and it has sort of project-based vouchers and those sort of things. It's governed by all of the DHCR rules and regulations. So essentially, even though we're saying supportive housing, it is a rent stabilized housing just as well. And right. And so it builds that stock of rent stabilized, and that's where there are rights and there are rules, and we can't just throw people out, and we got to go to court, and we can't just raise people's rents. We can only do so based on the DHCR guidelines. And in most cases, if there's a subsidy on the unit, it's going to be any rent increases or other things are governed by that. At our Hamilton project, which is Mitchell-Lama, we have not had an increase since 2015. We just put in an application and was granted, increases over the next 3 years. But that all goes through a process that has to get a HPD approval. We can't just go and raise the rent ourselves. And I think that's an important piece in preserving supportive housing. And in our cases, with some of the things we're doing with air rights and other things, we're doing that for perpetuity. So our buildings, we can never take out of a supportive housing space. I mean, I'm sorry, an affordable housing space. Because,
if you're in a rent stabilized apartment, one of the older rent stabilized, you could be there until you move. You're under that rent stable, and that would work the same for your building. Okay, thank you.
No, and in fact, just new affordable housing is rent stabilized. You have to register it with the state into the stabilization program.
Great, thank you.
Can I just stick in a question? When you say rent stabilized, though, if it's rent stabilized supportive, what is the rental structure? Is it 30% of income? Is that what tenants would pay?
Of course, no answer. It's a complicated answer because it depends on whether or not it has an ongoing rental subsidy as part of it. So if in fact, and most of Wistfish's buildings actually have a rental subsidy as part of it, and in those buildings, the tenant will pay no more than 30% of their income, and then there's a rental subsidy that goes in to provide additional funds to allow the building to operate. If in fact it's a very low income resident.
Thank you. Ken?
Yes, thank you. It was great to see the inside of 108th Street, having fought for it at the community board many years ago. I have two questions, sort of more policy, one for Paul and one for Mark and Paul. For Paul, what percentage of shelter residents move on to or find permanent housing, if you know, or roughly? And for Mark and Paul, given the huge waiting lists, what would it take for all the seniors that need the housing to get the housing in our city? Is it more money for supportive housing? Is it a lack of housing stock? How do we get there?
So I'll start with the shelter question, then maybe Mark, you can start in on the senior housing question. In theory, everybody who lives in a shelter eventually moves on to permanent housing. The metric that's discussed a lot is how long they remain in shelter until they are able to then move into permanent housing. One misunderstanding here is I think a lot of people think, if they were just in shelter for one day and they moved on, that would be the best situation. But what often happens in shelter is that actually people are stabilized. They get medical care that they need. They potentially might get psychiatric care. They actually in a way do what they need to do in order to then be able to be stable in permanent housing. So it's not just that they're in the shelter until they can find permanent housing. If it's a quality shelter, there actually will be sort of services provided in that shelter that will actually help that person then succeed once they move out of shelter and into permanent housing.
From a policy standpoint, related to what would help in many ways, I think it is on a federal level, looking at some of the policies as it relates to what definitions of chronic homeless and some other things. I think there are some people who may be in transitional housing or other sort of entities, not necessarily a shelter or not necessarily a street, that are still homeless, that we're not counting and not seeing in that particular way based on some federal definitions. But I also think in the city, some of the things that helped during the pandemic was the use of emergency housing vouchers or city FEPS vouchers. And those vouchers being able to be prioritized for some of the folks in the shelters have opened up a number of opportunities for people to get into housing throughout New York and even in some other spaces. And so I think that's to maintain and to be able to support the voucher systems in that way would be awesome. And I do want to commend the city. I am in a number of work groups that are looking at how it can streamline some of the processes related to the referral processes for people using the housing applications and the referral systems related to Department of Homeless Services, the shelters and Department of Homeless Services, and the travel pathways and the paperwork that gets people into housing. And they've listened to a number of providers and have been working very diligently to really streamline that, to automate some things and to get rid of extra reporting that really improves the speed of when a person is ready to get into that housing, to be able to help them get in. And I think those are important things that are happening.
I mean, one of the things that Wistfish thinks about in terms of sort of just, frankly, the insatiable need for affordable senior housing is, you can't build enough of it. There's such a need, you could just, you can build and build and build. But one of the things that we're trying to do is to also think about, okay, so we build affordable senior housing. It's great for the residents that live there. but how can that building also then be a resource to serve other seniors in the community? So, and like Project Find, one of our goals is to co-locate older adult centers, federally qualified health clinics, different community serving elements that can really allow that building not just to provide fantastic affordable housing for the seniors that live there, but could then also become support for the seniors in the community who don't live in that exact housing.
Okay, thank you. Courtney? Courtney.
Hi. So Courtney Clark-Matakis, I'm actually not on this committee, but I'm joining because I'm interested in this topic. My question is related to the point with which, Louisa, actually you started this meeting, the sheer need for affordable senior housing within the Community Board 7 boundaries. And as the slide that we saw made clear, that number is only going up over the coming years. My question is about whether these developments, and I'm thinking of, for example, the one on 79th Street, do they have any reserved allotments for senior residents in need of affordable housing who currently live and probably have lived in this district for decades and decades? I know from approaching this issue with my own aging family members how important it is for them to stay in familiar neighborhoods, close to doctors, close to friends. And I'm wondering if such a provision exists, and if it doesn't, more broadly, is that something we should be thinking about and talking about as a board? Because I know if I were doing this for one of my relatives, in fact, and I have, the refusal to consider anything outside of some strictly, what is familiar is a really powerful priority for some of my elderly relatives. And I expect it would be similar for a lot of these folks as well.
So I can jump on that because 108th Street is sort of an example of this. So fair housing, is an issue that is a federal issue. It's, a national issue. And outside of New York City, there's a lot of concern that actually, fair housing is addressing communities that are trying to be exclusive, trying to keep people out. And I just want to say that context because I just want to say that so you kind of understand that background. So at 108th Street, we were actually able to get what's called a community board preference for that building. So as people were, moving into 108th Street, there was a preference given to people who live in CB7, and that's great. And for a long time, that was the case. Unfortunately, because of issues outside of New York City, where people would use sort of local preference to kind of keep people out of their community. So you might be a predominantly white town, you build affordable housing, you say everybody who moves into this town needs to come from this town. And so it was perceived that that was actually working against people who were different from the people who live in that town. And so nationally, outside of New York, there was a big push to not have preferences for too small a geographic area. So for 108th Street, we were allowed to do for CB7. For the next series of projects that Wishfish did, we could only use a borough-wide preference. So we could say that, this building can only, has a preference for people living in Manhattan, but we couldn't do anything more micro than that. And that was in response to federal fair housing rules. Right now, there seems to actually be kind of a pushback against that. And maybe we will be moving back to an era where the sort of local preference could be more on the order of, say, a community board. But this is something people are always very frustrated about this. Why can't there be a strong preference, say, just for the community board? We completely agree with that idea. And I think a lot of people in New York City agree with that idea. But we're sort of battling right now fair housing rules, which are based on a sort of national context.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you very much. I appreciate that answer.
Interesting. Paige.
Thank you. First of all, amazing presentation. I'm an interloper. I usually do preservation and land use. And every time I get a chance to peek in under the tent of what's happening in housing, I get excited, but then I get terribly worried. And I joined the community board about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And I remembered my first tour looking at some of the buildings that you renovated and made habitable. Because I remember somebody said, don't lean against the wall because the bed bugs will jump onto your coat and things like that. And I just cringed. I wasn't afraid, but it was just the conditions that you guys have to start with. So my questions are related to, why does it seem to take so long to initiate these projects? I know you're competing with developers, and I get very distressed when I see a lot of the buildings on Columbus Avenue being turned into these mega mansion apartment type things. And it would be, those buildings would seem to fit your program ideally. So I'm just telling you all this as a supporting community board member, but I never hear what it is that we should be doing to be proactive to get, I know that several board members do this privately through their own initiative with nonprofits, but what should we be doing? Because it doesn't seem that we're very successful in moving the time frame to help these people get settled sooner.
Mark, do you want to start?
Too much.
I mean, so there's we can probably, the main thing is speed of getting things that we need. So if there's an HPD sign off that we need, or sort of access to the acquisition fund, so we may have to go through various programs to be able to get those acquisition funds, because again, we don't have, for example, it was $26 million for Park 79. Now Fairstead is a little bit wealthier organization than Project Find, and so they could probably come in with that type of financing. We might come in at 4 million and need to get the rest from other places. And so that takes time. And for example, the 101st Street, we actually lost out to someone that put in a lower bid, right? And than us by $3 million, right? And the landlord was willing to take that lower bid based on the fact that I feel like I can close this deal a lot faster than with this nonprofit entity, that I need to wait for the government to sign off on something, and I don't know when that's going to happen. And so a lot of times that's a big factor, is just our access to the fluid capital to be able to close deals a little bit more quickly.
I mean, I say the two things that, anyone can do. One is to support the projects and overcome community opposition, which, it's luckily, I feel like, the Upper West Side is a fairly enlightened place to try to do this sort of work. But throughout a lot of the city, community opposition, can both stop and dramatically slow down projects. So that's one very clear thing people can do. The other is, kind of when I talked about how an awful lot of the funding for this starts at the federal government, then, flows to the states, and then flows to the city. I mean, in New York City, where there's a very sophisticated, highly developed, sort of mechanism in place for developing affordable housing, the big thing that delays the project is just the availability of funds. HPD actually has a pretty good backlog of projects that they want to proceed with, but they're actually waiting for the funding, which flows from the feds to the state, into the city for the most part. And so they can only do a limited number of projects per year based on how much funding they have access to. We were all very hopeful that the Inflation Reduction Act would actually, bring in a lot more money for housing. In the end, it did not deliver on housing in the way that it delivered, and other things that were very, very good. But I think people think about advocacy on the city level, but it's very important to also advocate at the state, and frankly, very importantly, at the federal level.
Thank you. Do you have your hand up? Okay, Molly, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm very interested in your idea. You said you want to have some community facility, not only for the residents use, also open to the all the seniors in the community. So I'm curious, like, what's your plan, like how to run this non-residential youth program in the building? Like, will you like partner with other organizations or run by yourself? Where will you get the fund? And also like, will they have separate entrance with the residents? Like, how will it goes?
Mark, do you want to respond first? Or?
And I didn't fully understand the question as I think I was hearing what I did hear is about the programs and whether we run them ourselves or if we're bringing in others to run the program. And I did hear about the separate entrances, if we're doing separate entrances for those sort of things, if I'm hearing correctly. I'll start with the entrances. Excuse me. One, I'm excited for Paul's project, right? In the way that they are doing that. I think the Pour Door sort of entrance was cut off, and I think should probably stay off as we really integrate. I think my work prior to here was with community access, and which started a lot of the beginning family sort of integration of single adult homeless with families. And initially, the executive director there, Steve Code, trying to build these buildings, like, you can't do that. You can't put families with, homeless people. But they made that work. And I think the more we integrate, in general, and the more we try to build community, the better community will really be. So I don't think we intend, and a lot of times we run our own programming. We have the capacity we run our own senior centers, older adult centers. We run many of our own programs, and we dream up new programs all the time. And our boards are pushing us to be innovative, to think about how we can further serve the communities that we're in. And if we can't, we will partner, right? We recognize that there are things other people do even better than us, and we're all about partnering with other communities. I'm always touting DeRote, and we use them for a number of whether it's the meals or the technology programs, and especially during the pandemic. We partner with a number of other organizations that come in and help us with sort of folks who may stay in their apartments and not come out, and we're able to bring programming in to help with isolation, social isolation, et cetera.
And the big thing Wishfish is doing now is, we are not a medical provider. We don't want to be a medical provider, but responding to the health needs of our residents is really kind of what our social workers spend almost more time than anything doing. So we're actually pursuing a co-location strategy where in a lot of our new buildings, we are partnering with federally qualified health centers in order to have them, provide actually a medical center in the building, which of course our residents can benefit from, but also the greater community can as well. And so at 108th Street, we're partnering with the Institute for Family Health. We have two projects in the Bronx. One is partnered with Montefiore, and another is partnered with an FQHC called the Urban Health Plan, Inc. And we actually have another project that's under development that will also have a health center in it. So this is something that we're actively trying to do to have our buildings really, provide housing, but also really address, the health issues in a lot of these communities.
I want to add, though, I think that's some of the beauty of the ground up projects. And so you see a little bit of difference I heard you all earlier talking about a project that if we got to take over a project, there's a different kind of complexity in the financing and other things to get that up and running. And ground up, you have that ability to really put in things that the community needs just as well. If it's especially in the Bronx, I live in the Bronx, I always talk about the fact that everywhere I look, there is a new supportive housing project, at least 4 or 5 right in my neighborhood. But it also gives that opportunity where we're getting a grocery store, we're getting other kind of community-based resources that will benefit a number of folks.
Thank you. I have a question. The mayor has just come out with his new housing plan. He it is not specifically an affordable housing plan. I mean, he is just saying that he wants new housing. How is the housing plan going to affect you? How can you apply it to what you do? What do you think of it?
So I'm not fully versed in all the details of the plan yet. So I
None of us are.
haven't digested it enough to tell you exactly what I think. You know, I will say that we work through a lot of trade organizations as well. So we work with the Supportive Housing Network of New York. We work with the Corporation of Supportive Housing. I mean, we work with Live On. You know, so a number of organizations that also help us to do some of that digesting as we're running around doing some of the services, and help us to understand how some of these things affect us. And I would encourage more communication too with some of those organizations as well to in these spaces to be able to answer some of those questions. But I'm not ready to give an answer yet till I dive in a little bit more.
I mean, I'll say, I mean, just to maybe change the question around a little bit. I actually heard the governor speak a little bit less than 2 weeks ago, and boy, does she seem gung-ho about housing. So in her speech that she gave, she said, you know, she really couldn't reveal too much because she's going to be talking about a lot of things in the State of the State address. But, you know, it does seem now that she's, you know, actually been legitimately elected, that I'm hopeful that, you know, it does feel as though housing is going to be an important part of her agenda. And, you know, the thing is, you know, the city and state are linked like this, you know, and so if in fact, you know, the state is really prioritizing housing, I think that will have a good effect on what the city can do as well.
And to add in, you know, we've talked with both Paul and Mark about our district needs statement for fiscal year 2024, which is now up on our website. And we will be asking each of you again in probably end of May, because we're trying to get the timeline quicker for more specifics, because we've been told by city planning that if we know more specific things that we want in our community, we're more likely to not necessarily get them, but at least get answered. This has been fabulous. I want to thank you both so much. I want to remind everybody that Thursday, January 19th at 10 a.m., the Senior Task Force meeting will be joined by Elena and Carolyn from New York Academy of Medicine to present their images program, which shows where senior services and senior support are within our community.
And I want to just thank you all for inviting us, and you know, and on behalf of David Gilchrist, our executive director, who brings his greetings, just as well. And I love the community board, love the work that you all are doing, and I'm very happy to be connected in the senior task force and in other spaces, and look forward to continue to work with the community board as we try to expand here at Project Find as well.
We look forward to supporting you guys and the work that you do. Also, I hope that Molly can be in touch with you, because you have so much information, and that would be very helpful to the study that she's doing. So thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to you coming back, talking about all the new projects that will be coming up.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, we have the resolution on J51, but I think we may have a small problem. Shelley, as kind of a very knowledgeable person about the rules, I don't think we have enough people from the Housing Committee to pass a resolution. Am I correct?
That's the way it looks.
You need a quorum. How many people do you have?
We have, I think, 4.
And how many people are on the committee?
2, more than 8.
Then you can't.
We can't do it.
Even if there were 8, it wouldn't be enough.
Yeah.
I'm triple checking right now to see how many are total on the committee, and just in case, because there's been a lot of coming and going of committee members.
Yes, there
Just
has
about
been.
10 seconds.
Oh, Miranda's here.
You have 11 on the committee.
That's what I
You need
said.
6. You need 6.
So you need 6.
Yeah, I was counting and we don't have it. Richard, maybe we could do this a land use. I'm not sure. We put together a resolution supporting
is-
community design. I sent it around to everyone. I'm not sure what happens under these circumstances.
I can clarify,
Yes,
so
we
we're not
can.
able to vote tonight on it, but perhaps that will compel people to attend their committee meetings.
Well, okay.
Excuse me.
Richard has done fantastic work on this, and maybe, you know, we have land use, and maybe we could do this in land use, and we will talk about this. We will try to figure out how to do this.
Max, can a
I'm sorry?
resolution emerge from steering?
Yeah, I believe
It
so.
could. It
Yeah.
could come from steering or from land use.
I would think steering would make more sense at that point, but I would
It
defer
would.
to the co-chairs and the board chair.
Okay, and we will make an effort to get everybody, as many people there as we can.
Can you send the resolution around ahead of time?
Yeah. We've been sending it out on a regular basis.
I don't think I received it.
Sorry?
I have not received it.
I sent it around to the Housing Committee. Okay, so thank you, everybody. I think this was a great meeting. It was really interesting. Finding out exactly what they're doing. I didn't ask, but I will send, I'd be very interested in especially Wishfish's presentation, if they could send a copy to us, because
I
it
can reach
had
out to them for it.
a lot of data in it, which could be very interesting.
It's on our YouTube. It's on our YouTube now.
The Wishfish presentation?
It's up on our, this was Max recorded this, so it's in the record.
Of course, yeah,
So we have it.
okay. Hold on a second, I'm counting again. We still don't have enough people. So, thank you, everybody, for coming. We'll do J51 at Searing, and I think this was a good meeting. So,
Thank you.
thank you all.
Good night.